The first reverend of this church was Canon Nelson, this gentleman on the left, and he had actually been the last vicar of the first church. He had overseen the church through the intermediate years, and he was now the first vicar of this new church. And when he retired in 1907, 1908 onwards, you have Canon Watson, the gentleman on the right. This is him in his more advanced years. The best representation of him as a young man when he started here is actually a carving in one of the bosses in the Requiem Chapel, if you want to go investigate that during the break. His face is carved in the stone there. So that was Canon Watson, and he was here for a good number of years, actually. I think it was around 30 years he was the vicar here. And am I right? I'm looking to you now. 34 years he was the vicar here. Thank you, Esther. And during that time, he basically installed most of the glass that we're going to speak about. He was quite high church in his approach to Anglicanism and faith. And so to him, the beautification of this building was a high priority. He oversaw the stone carvings that we have everywhere. They weren't part of the original build. And he also installed these stained windows that we're going to talk about this evening. So these are the four that I'm going to talk about tonight. They are the lower western wall, and JJ has brilliantly lit them up for us from outside. And we're going to look at those in a little bit more detail. And then next week, we're going to look at the rose window and the windows that form up the nave. So a few names for the church building so you understand where you are. This middle bit is the nave, and the aisles are what's outside of the pillars. And so these we call the nave windows. That's the Requiem Chapel in that corner. We have the bell tower in this corner. We have the baptistry or baptismal. You have the Lady Chapel in this corner, the vestry in that corner, and the sanctuary there. And there's some other names you can chuck in. The only other one that might come up actually is the clerestory, which is this top layer up here of all of the plain glass, the clerestory. But that doesn't come up very often in conversation, so if you forget it, don't worry. So that's going to be our second talk, looking at those windows. And our third talk is going to be looking at the memorial glass. So the windows that we find in our chapels, the windows of the sanctuary, and also we're going to talk about that tram shelter that was a memorial building as well. But so to get things started, it's a common misconception that all colored glass is stained glass. I didn't know that it wasn't. Until a friend of mine, a guy called Evan Lewis, who's a scholar in all things stained glass, he actually wrote his master's thesis on the stained glass of 4 churches in Auckland, including St. Paul Simon Street. And if you'd like to kind of go deeper in your understanding, I can see if I can hook you up with his thesis. If tonight is just simply not enough, and you've got to go further, you can read that. It's a good read. So the 3 kinds of glass that we're going to talk about are cathedral glass, which is an example is our rose window. It's where you have a number of small panes that fill the window, and each pane is a different color, but they're one solid color per pane. And normally you have up to about 4 different colors in cathedral glass. We're quite fortunate we have 6 colors in ours, but that's unusual. Leaded glass is different. It's a paler glass. Ours are mostly blue or kind of a creamy color, and they're usually kind of regular patterns, such as the rectangles in our aisle windows. And then they usually contain small details within that. So that is what we would call leaded glass. And the third type is stained glass, which is where the whole panel is made up of painted and colored and dyed pieces of glass that make up an image. So these are the different types of glass. Our western 4 windows here that we're talking about this evening are all stained glass. And they're the earliest example of stained glass in this church. A few other terms that you'll hopefully find helpful. Lights is one, which is just another name for a window. Lancet is a window which is kind of tall and thin and has that arched top. The tracery is basically the detailed stonework at the top of a window, usually especially when several windows come together, they then have this ornate tracery. The rose window is a very clear example of that. A trefoil is basically like a 3-leaf clover kind of shape. A quatrefoil would be 4-leaf clover, and the last one is the rose, also sometimes called a wheel or a Catherine wheel, but we call ours a rose. Okay, and so this example here kind of contains all of those terms. You can see the tracery is the whole area, really the rose is the main circle, the lancet would be that central arched window, and then the trefoil and the quatrefoil are kind of highlighted in orange. Everyone happy with some terms? Yeah? Okay, great. Learning already. Now, in order to install a window in a church, it's quite an involved process. So a faculty has to be obtained, and so for that, so here's to take notes, those who want to start staining windows. The design has to be drawn and submitted, and then this plan is agreed upon by the donors next of kin, the congregation, the vicar, the vestry, the local archdeacon, the diocesan facilities committee, and finally then the bishop. They all have to sign it off. Now, as complicated as that is, by nature it ensures that no window is lightly chosen upon. Each window has a significance, and a lot of people kind of have their voice in the process. So the significance of each runs deep. So let's consider our windows. Our windows in these lower western four were created by Herbert Brothers. Herbert Brothers were an early Auckland stained glass firm. They were within the St. Paul's parish. And from 1911, fundraising had begun here to begin to replace some of the ugly yellow painted chancel windows with good leaded cathedral glass, according to the newspaper. Herbert Brothers wanted to establish their reputation as stained glass, as a stained glass name, and so they kind of offered to do these windows on condition that they would be able to present their windows at the entrance of the Auckland exhibition, which doesn't sound too fancy, but as you can see from those photos, it was a major event that spanned the whole summer of 1913 to 1914 and just kind of took over the whole of the domain. And it was sort of like New Zealand's miniature version of the Great Exhibition in the UK. And Herbert Brothers got to display their various glasswares, including our four windows, were placed right at the entrance. And they follow a theme of king, bishop, soldier, and pioneer. And that's something, if you didn't catch it now, don't worry, I'm going to say it again and again and again tonight. King, bishop, soldier, and pioneer. And what I love about these windows is that they were installed in 1913 and 1914 for the most part, but they actually reflect a scheme that already existed in this building. Because in 1910, a guy called Captain Felden, between 1910 and 1911, he spent 2 years carving all the stone in this church. And on the outside of our main entrance doors in the west and our other side door there from the south, you have these beautiful little carved bosses where the door arch, the hood, comes down and kind of terminates in these molds. And outside the main entrance door, you've got a king and a bishop, and outside the small car park door, you've got a knight and a pioneer. And our main two kind of themes are this idea of king and bishop, this joining of church and crown sovereignty. And as a result, Felden repeated the same scheme within the church. So we've actually got a bishop and a queen just there above our kind of, here we are, just up there. And then next to them we've got a king and a bishop. And then by the southern door we've got a king and a bishop again. And in that corner by the vestry we've got a king and a bishop again. So it's a theme that Felden had already introduced based on our heritage that the Herbert Brothers decided to develop into their windows. So there you go. So these are our four: king, bishop, knight, and pioneer. And it's reflected in our glass. So let's have a look at why these four. Why these four? Well, let's have a look at king. So St. Paul's was founded by Captain Hobson in April of 1841. And this was only 7 months after Captain had climbed the Auckland kind of landmass and placed a flag on what is now Upper Queen Street, which at the time was just a hill of bush and scrub, and he named it the new capital of New Zealand. 7 months later, he was laying the foundation stone for St. Paul's. It was the first Church of England parish in the country, establishing the new Crown authority as the head of the Anglican Church. The resident governors and the vice-regal officials of Auckland, they all worshipped at St. Paul's. And it houses the memorial stones and plaques to people like William Hobson, the first governor of New Zealand, and all three of our foundation stones laying, the first foundation stone of the original church, the same foundation stone relayed when this church was built, which is outside somewhere around there, on the outside near the bell tower. You'll see it's the same stone from 1841 that they relayed here in 1895. And then when they rebuilt the chancel, which we'll talk about in another time, but there's actually another foundation stone tucked down by the bins, by the crypt door. If you're ever up for a sneaky peek, head around the corner there from the crypt door and move a couple of bins and you'll find another foundation stone for the chancel laid in 1915. And all three of these foundation stone laying ceremonies were conducted by the governor of New Zealand, which is why we have this heritage of the king. So our second theme, and so here we go. This is actually a few photos for you. This is the land purchase deed for Auckland from 1840, and it signed, one of the witnesses to the agreement was actually a guy called James Coates, and we've got his memorial plaque in our Requiem Chapel. Here on the left are the architectural plans for the first church of St. Paul's, drawn by William Mason in 1841. And interestingly, actually, his architectural plans, it's labeled the Metropolitan Church of Auckland. It wasn't called St. Paul's originally. It was the Metropolitan Church of Auckland. It wasn't called St. Paul's until it was consecrated in 1843. And on the right, we have a sketch here by a guy called Felton Matthew, and he was the first Surveyor General of Auckland. He's the guy who mapped out Auckland City originally. He's the guy who climbed Rangitoto with James Busby and some of those first people to arrive, and started to kind of map out the topography of the region to begin to plan this city. And he sketched St. Paul's. He actually lived right next to the original St. Paul's Church, and this was his sketch as well. And we have Felton Matthews Memorial in our Requiem Chapel too. And these are them, actually. So we've got a memorial here to Coates. This is the one to William Mason. This is the one to Felton Matthew. This is our oldest plaque. And this is the one to Captain Hobson, the first governor of New Zealand, who incidentally, after laying the foundation stone, then died a year later before St. Paul's Church was opened or completed. And so when they were building the church, they then put his memorial stone in the walls. And this is a photo I love. It's quite a rare photo of the inside of the very first St. Paul's Church. This is from 1863. And if you look at the right-hand side, you've got a lovely inclusion there of Felton Matthews' memorial plaque and probably Hobson's memorial stone, right there in that very first church. And so there are a few things that surround us here today that actually go right back to our original roots. This is a photograph of the foundation ceremony for this church building in 1895. I don't know which one is the governor, but he's in the crowd somewhere. Interestingly, actually, I'll just point out, if you notice how high the structure is already at the laying of the foundation stone, you can see that actually they'd already built up to about this level already across the nave. And if you've ever seen St. Paul's from outside down that hill by Queen Street, you'll know that's quite a height before they've even laid the foundation stone. So construction actually began probably around 1893, and then the church was opened in 1895. Just a little side note for you. So Bishop, St. Paul's was the first Anglican parish in the country. It was often called the Mother Church. It was the episcopal seat of Bishop Selwyn, the first bishop of New Zealand. In fact, we still have his bishop's throne. It's there in our sanctuary. And that came to New Zealand in 1843 with Bishop Selwyn, and was placed in the first the first church of St. Paul's, and then was reinstalled here. St. Paul's, the original St. Paul's, was actually the pro-cathedral for New Zealand for the first 40 years until they were able to establish another cathedral. It was the location of many significant ordinations, especially of Bishop Patterson, who we're going to talk about a bit more in our third week, who was ordained in St. Paul's in 1861. And when Bishop Selwyn left New Zealand, even though he'd been the Bishop of all New Zealand and then had done all these things for 14 years, his farewell service was held back at St. Paul's before he left New Zealand. We also hosted the very first synod at St. Paul in New Zealand, was held at St. Paul's. And so all of these things kind of add up to our heritage as, with the image of the bishop. And this is a photograph that I found that's got both Bishop Patterson and Bishop Selwyn in the same shot. So our third window is the soldier. And our church building, our original building at Emily Place, incidentally, Emily Place is so called because Captain Hobson's wife was called Emily, and so they decided to place the church there, and it was a small walk from there to the barracks, which Fort Britomart, which used to be on what is, when we think of Britomart now, we know it as a low-lying level area of kind of harbour land. Originally, it was actually, it was a point that overlooked the water and the harbour and everything else. When I do a talk on the history of St. Paul's, I'll go into that in a bit more detail, but basically they decided to mine away the whole point and use it as landfill, and also they found it contained coal. So they basically mined by hand and machine the whole thing right the way back up to Emily Place, which is why the first church was eventually demolished, because it was unstable ground, and it was literally right on the precipice of where they were mining. But its original location was right next to Britomart Barracks. Every week, the soldiers and the officers would march to church in their full-dress uniform. With its intrinsic ties to the governance, military leadership of the day, including William Dean Pitt, the general of all New Zealand forces, Captain Simons, who we've got Simon Street named after, Captain Wynyard, who we also have Wynyard Street named from, and Captain Thomas Mould, who was a significant officer in the New Zealand Wars. So we were called the Church of the Garrison. In fact, actually, when the New Zealand Wars kicked off, there were fears in Auckland that the Maori would move down and attack the city. And so St. Paul's was actually commandeered by the military and turned into a military hospital. The land around it was leveled, the scrub and fencing was removed, the windows were barricaded with gun loops, and it was served as kind of a last stand point and as a military hospital in case the city was attacked. It never was attacked, and so that was then done away with. Never mind. And then again, when a similar war happened, it served as a military hospital again. Again, the city was never attacked, but twice St. Paul's was used to kind of service the garrison that way. The 58th Foot Regiment, which was the regiment stationed at Fort Britomart and then later at Albert Barracks, when they left New Zealand in 1858, they actually gifted their flag or their regimental colours to St. Paul's. Now, as an English thing, I don't know if you know this, but when a regiment has a flag, it has to be blessed by the king, and so, or the queen. And so they touch the flag and they bless it, and then it becomes sacred, and it's called a colours, not a flag. And so when that regiment no longer exists, those colours can't be destroyed because they're considered, special, I guess, in that way. So what they do is they donate them to a church or a kind of some other kind of significant building where they hang and they're allowed to naturally deteriorate. Which is why if you go to some of these really old churches or places in England, you'll find some regimental flags that are absolutely threadbare, and they go right the way back to the medieval period. And that's essentially what happens to a regiment's colours. So the 58th Foot Regiment, because of their ties with St. Paul's, gifted their colours to St. Paul's when they left New Zealand in 1858. If you're interested to see them, they're in the Auckland Museum. There's a story behind that, but I won't go into it. So this map here shows you the proximity of St. Paul's, circled in red, to the Fort Britomart. You can see a painting of what Fort Britomart looked like. It wasn't a particularly impressive fort, but it did have a ring of cannons that overlooked the harbour. This is a watercolour painting, and I love it because it shows St. Paul's in quite a beautiful light there, I think, and you've got the troops literally marching past it in their red uniforms. And this is actually Colour Sergeant John Mitchell, who's holding the colours of the 58th Foot Regiment at a time where there was this big controversy in the newspapers that lasted for 8 years of what to do with the colours of the regiment. In the end, it ended up going to Auckland Museum. The short version is, they were gifted to St. Paul's, and they were accepted, and then Bishop Selwyn said no. He thought it was inappropriate to have a flag used in violence against the Maori to then hang in a place of peace where they were welcome. And I agree with him. And I think it was actually quite insightful at the time because no one else really was of that wavelength. And so that's why he refused them. Canon Nelson later, who was much more kind of old school English, Oxford, Cambridge type, he was keen to have the flag here because of its significance, historical significance, and the ties with the church. We also have a lot of memorial plaques to various troops, some of them going right back again to that very first church, those first days of conflict. And they're all in our Requiem Chapel. So again, when we get to the break time, have a little nosy around there and see what you find. There's some really interesting things. So all of these things add up to our theme of soldier. So our fourth area is that of pioneer. We've mentioned that it was the Metropolitan Church of Auckland. It was the first of so many things, as we've already mentioned. It was the pioneer, really, of so much stuff. Ushered British church into the New Zealand context. It was the first permanent church structure in New Zealand, which I think is quite a significant claim. Again, people like Felton Matthew, the first Surveyor General, and William Mason, the first Superintendent of Public Works, literally were the men that built our first church. Its first vicar was the first incumbent of New Zealand. Again, you just talk about it, and every sentence kind of has first in front of it. First this, first that, which is really why it's pioneer. I love some of the old paintings and drawings of Auckland back in those first decades. And you can see St. Paul stands there like this brick beacon on a hill, promising, amid the wooden shacks and tents that surround it, that there is going to be this grand city, that we're here to build, I guess, the new London. That's why St. Paul's was named St. Paul's, after the cathedral in London. So there we go. There are 4 windows. But it raises the question, so we understand our themes, we understand our heritage, but why were these individuals chosen to represent these areas? And before I can answer that question, I just need to highlight the significance the different significances to consider when picking a window. First of all, a window should have ecclesiastic significance. It needs to be relevant to church history, particularly British church history, being a Church of England and Anglican church. It needs to have local significance, something specific to this church, to this parish, to our story as a congregation. It should have personal significance, because a window almost always commemorates a particular individual or a donor, and so usually they have a say in the representation of the window as well, that it's related to the person it remembers. And very often, but not always, a window will fall within an overall scheme. It might be for a part of a building, or it might be for the whole building. We've obviously highlighted our scheme of king, bishop, soldier, and king that already existed in the stonework, and are kind of themes within our heritage. And then lastly, there's the immediate context. What kind of technology is available, what companies are available to help, that kind of thing. So we're going to look at one of the four windows, and then we're going to take a little break. But I think overall we draw primarily from our historical significance. So that's a mix really of our ecclesiastic and our local significance. But there's also an element of the personal significance too, and we'll kind of go through that with each window. So our first window is King Oswald of Northumbria, and he represents our king. Now, King Oswald was born in 604. The short version is his father was killed, and so he was driven into exile into Ireland. And while he was in Ireland, he learned the Celtic language, and he converted to Christianity. Now, the guy who killed his father was a guy called Edwin, and when he was killed in battle, these were savage times, he decided to try and claim the throne back for himself. And so he took a small army and marched to claim the throne. Now, on the night before the battle, Oswald had a vision where he saw St. Columba promising him a great victory and a happy reign, essentially the throne would be his. Now, Oswald told his battle council about this, and they were thrilled, and they all promised to be baptized after the battle. And then Oswald erected a wooden cross in front of his army, and he knelt down and he prayed, and he asked his army to join him in prayer before the battle. And then they went to get amongst it, I guess, and despite being hugely outnumbered, they won a massive victory, and they killed the enemy king, and Oswald became the new king of the Northumbrian throne. And for 9 years, he reigned over a united Northumbria. He was described as the God-ordained emperor of all Britain by Adamnan. And Bede, who's pretty much the most significant Anglo-Saxon historian, says that Oswald brought under his dominion all the nations and provinces of Britain. These are the two kingdoms here. This is Bernicia and Deira, and these were essentially two rival factions that were always trying to take over Northumbria. Northumbria was one of the more dominant of the kingdoms in what was then a very fractured Britain. This is a stained glass window of Oswald building his cross and praying with his army. And so he managed to unite the Northumbrian throne, and he was the most powerful king, and so he essentially made all the other kings subject to him, and so he kind of begins to mark a sense of a united Britain in a very, very early, loose kind of way. And again, for a short period, it doesn't last. But after becoming king, Oswald asked the Irish to send a bishop, a guy called Bishop Aidan, and he wanted them for the conversion of the Northumbrian people. Bishop Aidan was very successful in spreading Christianity. He literally converted Northumbria. The only problem was he didn't speak the dialect, and so King Oswald, king though he was, would travel around with Bishop Aidan and would interpret his sermons as he would preach to the people. Oswald is also famous for being very, very generous to the poor and the strangers. He even appointed a servant who was appointed to relieve the poor. And there's one famous story where he's sitting with Bishop Aidan and they're eating at Easter, and before them is a silver dish full of dainties. When the servant appointed to relieve the poor reported a crowd of beggars requesting alms from the king, and at once Oswald ordered that the food be given to the poor, and even the silver dish was to be broken up and distributed. So King Oswald was a saintly king, and also in a significantly different way. Most saintly kings are considered saintly because they either abdicate the throne to then become a monk or live in a life of seclusion, or they're a saintly king because they're martyred, doing something for God. Whereas Bede makes a real point that Oswald was a saintly king during his reign. Besides his acts of generosity, his public piety, the Christianization of Northumbria, and beyond, he also created one of the most significant British monasteries on the Isle of Lindisfarne that became really significant over the coming centuries. especially when the Vikings were ransacking the rest of the country, this lovely little island managed to keep some of these church treasures that are so crucial for us today. He was also sponsor to the West Saxon king's baptism. Now, in 642, Oswald died in battle against the Mercian king Penda. It was recorded that when Oswald saw he was about to die, he prayed for the souls of his troops and ended his life in prayer. And after his death, he was revered as a saint. His remains became holy relics, and the cult of Oswald lasted for literally centuries. There were so many stories and reports of miracles happening at the site where Oswald died that people started taking earth from the ground where he died, so much so that there was a hole 6 foot deep because people had removed so much earth. And so Oswald is actually quite a regular character in English churches. He appears regularly in stained glass, very often right alongside Bishop Aidan, since they work so closely together. And then again, there was this whole cult of Oswald. There's many places in England that kind of either churches named after Oswald or towns and villages and things that draw their names from Oswald. Oswestry, for example, where the tree that Oswald was by. So Oswald's a significant person in history. So so he seems to tick all the boxes for our window. He's ecclesiastically appropriate because he links British church history with this idea of king, or the scheme of king. Locally, the window represented Crown authority in New Zealand, which was uniting peoples, culture groups, religions, and dialects under one rule, and Oswald did just that. And lastly, this window, along with its pair, Archbishop Theodore of Tarsus, who we'll talk about after the break, was dedicated to the soldiers who fell in the New Zealand Wars. This is why Oswald in our window holds both the wooden cross from the story of the battle, but also has a sword by his waist, highlighting not only his saintly nature, but also his military prowess. Around the shield at his base, it says, "Be strong and play the man," which sounds like a line from Shakespeare. But actually, it's Joab's speech in 2 Samuel 10:12, where David's army defeats the Ammonites, paralleling Oswald's victory at Heavenfield. And what is distasteful to us today, at the time, was probably also a reference to the British troops who fought the Maori, to which this window is dedicated. And on that rather sad note, let's take a break. Okay, so we're kind of on our second window now, which is our church window. And the character represented is Archbishop Theodore, or Theodore of Tarsus, Archbishop of Canterbury. He's a remarkable figure. He was born in Tarsus, in Silesia, in 602, and he was a Byzantine Greek, which basically is sort of like the eastern half of the Roman Empire, and then when the Romans fell in 402, the Byzantium kind of continued, and this is when he was born 200 years later in 602. He studied and ministered in Antioch and Constantinople, which were kind of like real centers of education in the ancient world, and it was at age 66, when he was massively respected and very, very well educated, that he was ordained Archbishop of Canterbury by Pope Vitalian. I hope I'm saying his name right. And this was the highest church office in Britain. Now, age 66 is kind of expected today, but it certainly wasn't at the time. And so Theodore took to his new role as the Archbishop of Canterbury with impressive gusto for a man of his age, probably because he thought he didn't have very long left on the clock. He rode by horseback up and down the country and kind of assessed the nature or the condition of the English church as it was, and it was in a pretty shoddy condition by this point. He gathered scholars wherever he went and began to kind of organize the church. He appointed new bishops. Here we go. He appointed new bishops to fill vacant posts. He called synods to instigate wide reforms. He settled church disputes, particularly around Easter. He established episcopal authority, essentially tying the church firmly under the hand of Rome and the Pope. He organized monks, he introduced church rituals and prayers, and so on. The guy was a massive organizer. He was also a man of huge authority. Wilfrid, the Archbishop of York, opposed his division of Northumbria into 2 manageable dioceses, and so Theodore deposed and expelled him. The Archbishop of York was the second most powerful office in England. And then later on, the Mercian king killed a Northumbrian prince in battle, and it sparked a war between Mercia and Northumbria. But Theodore dramatically intervened and prevented the escalation of war and negotiated a lasting peace between the Mercians and the Northumbrians, which is quite an impressive feat. Most significantly, though, Theodore established a school at Canterbury, and this school ushered in a golden age of Anglo-Saxon scholarship. He introduced sacred music, the Litany of the Saints, notes for biblical commentaries, and a number of significant texts. Our historian friend Bede recalls, "They attracted a large number of students into whose minds they poured the waters of wholesome knowledge day by day. In addition to instructing them in the Holy Scriptures, they also taught their pupils poetry, astronomy, and the calculation of the church calendar. Never had there been such happy times as these since the English settled Britain." High praise indeed from the historian Bede. Eventually, Theodore did die at the age of 88 in 690, and this was at a time where the average life expectancy in Britain was 24. He was venerated as a saint and became historically known as the great organizer of the Anglo-Saxon Church, leaving behind him an established English hierarchy and structure across all the different peoples and kingdoms. So Archbishop Theodore is a really great choice for our bishop's window. He was the Archbishop of Canterbury, and Canterbury was the very first episcopal see established in Britain. So basically, Pope Gregory sent St. Augustine back in the day, and Augustine rocked up and had a chat with King Ethelbert, and he converted to Christianity, and the first thing he did was basically establish the Canterbury Cathedral, or the grounds of what is now Canterbury Cathedral. And so the very first bishop of the very first episcopal see in Britain was Augustine at Canterbury. And so in the same way, St. Paul's was the very first Anglican parish in New Zealand. And so again, it's an excellent parallel between the two. Also, there's no closer representation of Bishop Selwyn than Bishop Theodore. Archbishop Theodore. In 1909, the Dominion of Wellington compared the two bishops, saying Selwyn's scheme for the restoration of the church system of dioceses, councils, and synods was the great work of his life. In the same way, it was for Archbishop Theodore. Bishop Averill made similar comparisons in 1915. He said the coming of Selwyn was to be compared with the coming to England of Archbishop Theodore, who in the 7th century joined the various missions into a united church of England. So, also, just as Theodore established a school at Canterbury, which kind of ushered in this golden age of learning, St. Paul's also, right from its outset, had a school hall attached to the church. And as far as I am aware, but I do need to verify this, it was probably the first school or one of the very first schools providing education for boys or for children in Auckland. And it's always had a school. Even the crypt downstairs was originally actually the St. Paul's Sunday School when this church was opened, and it's called the School Hall in the earlier references. So, as a final nod to Selwyn as well, Theodore's scroll is written in Latin. It says this, which literally translated just means the work and ministry of a man named Theodore. But it highlights this multilinguistic abilities. I don't know if you know this, but Bishop Selwyn learned fluent Te Reo on his journey over from England. During that passage, he learned it completely and was able to read and write it by the time he got here and converse fluently with the natives. So the last connection to make then is how, and his dying words on his deathbed were also in Te Reo, even though he was dying in England. The last connection to make then is how Archbishop Theodore represents the British troops, because remember, or maybe I haven't mentioned this, but both of those two windows of king and bishop were kind of commemorated together the troops of the New Zealand Wars. So how does Bishop Theodore relate to the British troops? Well, he doesn't really, not really as a person, but in his link to Bishop Selwyn, there is a link. So Selwyn was actually the army chaplain to General Cameron's forces in the Waikato in 1863. He kind of realized that military action between the Europeans and the Maori was inevitable by this point, and so he wanted to be able to be a minister of peace right there in the conflict, in the action. Unfortunately, this intention and this sentiment was misunderstood, and it brought a lot of accusations against the Anglican Church and Bishop Selwyn as being essentially a traitor who had always pretended to be a friend of the Maori, and now he was the official chaplain to the officially British invading forces. And this really marred his reputation. It's a real tragedy. And in fact, actually, Selwyn is famous for saying, I am sitting among my own ruins, not moping, but tracing the outlines of a new foundation. After 14 years as bishop, Selwyn's farewell service was held at St. Paul's Church, again, before he left these shores. So again, there's just very, very strong ties between Selwyn and Theodore, and Selwyn has close ties with the military in that sense. He was the army chaplain for a very unfortunate period. So that's our third window. Our second window. We come to our third, the soldier. And this one is more challenging than the others to unravel, because basically this guy, Theodoric of Nyssa, is a historical nobody. I did a talk I did a talk I think 2 years ago on Anzac Day and talked about this window in a little bit more detail. And so some of this may be repeated material, if you remember that. But what I think we have to do with this window is kind of start at the end and work backwards, rather than thinking, how does this guy relate to the military or the soldier theme, is start thinking about who is this window dedicated to. And it's dedicated to a guy called Travers McLean. And he was a member not only of St. Paul's, but also of the St. John's Ambulance. And this is significant because it's right there in his brass plaque that used to hang directly underneath the windows. When we finish, you're very welcome to go along and finger the wall, and you'll see there's, underneath every window, there are various holes drilled into the wall, many of which have little wooden corks stuffed in them, and these were the anchor points where they anchored these dedication plaques that used to be underneath all of the windows. They're now hanging in the Requiem Chapel. But this was the one that hung under that window. So why Theodoric of Nyssa, the Grand Prior of Knights Hospitallers? Well, to understand that, we need to, first of all, recognize Travers McLean's link with St. John's Ambulance, and secondly, the link of Knights Hospitallers with St. John's Ambulance. So a little bit of history. The Order of the Knights of Hospitaller was founded in 1113 to defend pilgrims and to care for the sick and needy in Jerusalem, regardless of their faith or their race. When Jerusalem was conquered by the Crusaders, after that point, they became known as the Knights of St. John's Hospital of Jerusalem, which is where they had established their headquarters. Around 1140, the order were granted a 10-acre site in Clerkenwell in London, where they built a medieval priory as their English headquarters, which in 1542, Henry VIII dissolved, as you probably are aware. Henry VIII kind of did the reformation of the churches, and he dissolved most of the monasteries and places in the country. Among them was the headquarters at Clerkenwell, and most of that land was seized, most of the buildings destroyed. I think all that remains today is the gatehouse. And so Henry VIII seized their lands in 1542. Also, by that point, of course, the Crusader kingdom was very much a thing of the past, and the Order of St. John's Hospital of Jerusalem had moved to Cyprus, to Rhodes, and to Malta. So by the 19th century, the order sought a new role to play in Britain. It had lost its headquarters, but it wanted to establish itself again in ways that were significant and consistent with its founding principles. And so in 1877, they founded the St. John's Ambulance Association. That was then blessed by Queen Victoria, and it's now in 42 countries around the world with over 300,000 members, and it's the entity that we know as St. John's, with first aid and everything else. And so since Travers McLean was so closely connected with St. John's, it finds its roots in the Knights Hospitallers. So as head of the English chapter at Clerkenwell in London, Theodoric of Nyssa seems like a sensible choice. He's got strong English roots, even though he himself was a German, but that doesn't matter because Oswald was a Bernician and Theodore was a Byzantine Greek, so that doesn't matter as long as they're kind of English in some way. He was also a monk, someone of deep faith, because he's the Grand Prior of the Knights Hospitallers. And a prior is essentially a type of monk. So he's someone of deep faith in living service and sacrifice to God. So we can tick the boxes that he is a military figure connected to the Church of England and relevant to the dedicated individual. However, and this is kind of us working backwards, if we now work forwards and we think, okay, we've got the St. John's Ambulance, we've got England and English kind of history, some kind of relationship to the church, that would still give you 32 possible Grand Priors of Knights Hospitallers from Clerkenwell House in London. So why Theodoric of Nyssa out of that 32? Is that making sense, by the way? Yeah? Okay. This is how I think. I got there and I was like, well, then why him? Many of the others on that list accomplished great military feats or attained powerful national influence. And so why him? Because essentially we only have two tiny fragments that refer to Theodoric of Nyssa. And the first and the main one is this. It's an excerpt from Matthew Paris's Historia Anglorum, or the History of England, written in 1253. And he says, The Hospitallers sent their prior, Theodoric, a German by birth, and a most clever knight, with a body of other knights and stipendiary attendants, and a large sum of money, to the assistance of the Holy Land. They, having made all the arrangements, set out from their house at Clerkenwell, and proceeded in good order with about 30 shields uncovered and spears raised, and proceeded with their banner through the midst of the city towards the bridge, that they might obtain the blessings of the spectators, and bowing their heads with their cowls lowered, commended themselves to the prayers of all. There's one other minor note that we have beside his name on a list of registers of the various grand priors, and it simply says, "He gave to the sisters of Buckland and their successors a substantial sum of money to be paid at 2 different periods of the year on condition that prayers should be offered up for the repose of the said Theodoric and his successors." These 2 scraps are all that exists, pretty much, of this guy. So how do they even know about him in the first place? Was one of my questions. And I think my argument is if you would have looked at that list of priors and you had to pick one, then he's a good choice because he's not a military giant. I think if we were to pick someone and commemorate them that we knew about their great acts of violence that they committed on other people, then that starts to become problematic when you want to remember them, immortalize them, in a window in a church. So my argument is that he was a successful military figure, but he was also a church member and a grand prior. And the only things that we know about him from history is he responded to a crusader defeat, and in doing so, he made himself acts of humility, acts of piety, requests for prayer, donations to, for further prayers for his soldiers, and the motto of "For the service of mankind" is wrapped around the base of the window, around the shield, which again highlights, I think, the significance of what the Knights Hospitalis stood for, which was service and care for those in need, regardless of race or faith. And so this may not be a completely accurate way to symbolize the British troops that this window commemorates. But we should bear in mind that the men and the officers of Fort Britomart and Albert Barracks did worship at St. Paul's. They did have a genuine faith. And the memorial plaques that line our Requiem Chapel are testament to the strong interplay between faith and duty that existed at the time. So, in that sense, you kind of can't pick a better guy than Theodoric of Nyssa, even though you won't find him in a history book. Trust me, I've looked. Which brings us to, so here we are. So, Hospitaller windows are quite unusual, and Crusade windows, obviously for the stigma attached to them, rightfully so. But there are a few. These are a couple I think I found from England. So lastly, the pioneer, Geoffrey Chaucer. Yeah. So our last window is the black sheep of the family. The other 3 were all installed in 1913 and 1914. This one wasn't installed until 1938. That 4th pane was plain up until that point. Not only that, but the other 3 have very clear ties with the Church of England, whereas Chaucer was a bit of a cheeky fellow who criticized the English church through popular satire. And while the other 3 represent specific groups of people, be they governors or soldiers or bishops, our 4th symbolizes a sentiment or a pioneer nature. So again, it's different in that sense. So at first glance, Geoffrey Chaucer seems like an odd choice, because his most famous work, the Canterbury Tales, which incidentally is written in his shield on the base of the window, is the story of a group of pilgrims journeying to Canterbury Cathedral to pay homage at the shrine of Thomas Becket. His medley of characters include 4 churchmen, all of which are immoral hypocrites personifying the perceived evils of the medieval English church. There's the prioress, or the nun. She is naive, and her compassion is misguided. She feeds meat to the dogs while ignoring the starving poor. The monk is fat and well-dressed. He's a lover of hunting and horses, in contradiction to his holy orders of poverty and obedience. The friar disdains a life of begging and generosity, and instead gives easy penance in exchange for higher donations and keeps the proceeds for himself. And the pardoner is the most hypocritical of all, embodying the very sins of greed and fraud and drunkenness that he preaches against. So together this band paint a rather strong critical case of the church. However, Chaucer's attitude towards the church should not be confused with his attitude towards Christianity. Chaucer respected and admired sincere Christians and was one himself. And besides this handful of miscreants in the crowd is a whole bunch of genuine, sincere, and devout pilgrims on their way to Canterbury. Among them is Chaucer himself. When properly understood, then, Geoffrey Chaucer is actually a real defender of the true church, that is, genuine believers and followers of Jesus Christ, which renders him actually wholly appropriate for our window as being, linked with the Church of England. So we've established this theme and the ties with the Church of England, but what about our pioneer state? Who was the window dedicated to, and why was it a 24-year delay before it was installed? Well, in England, Chaucer... I might be jumping ahead there, sorry. Chaucer represents a return to an English culture, because the Norman conquest of 1066 had kind of had its implications. It introduced feudalism into England, and Geoffrey Chaucer kind of marks the beginning of a shift where he starts writing popular literature in the vernacular, so the language that people can kind of access and understand. He's considered the ushering in the new Middle English, and kind of in the same way that the Norman conquest of 1066 marks the end of the Dark Age and the beginning of feudalism, in the same way Chaucer marks the beginning of Middle English, or a return to an English culture instead of a French one. Likewise, St. Paul's represented the first steps towards English religion amid what was viewed as a primitive colony. At its foundation stone laying, Governor Hobson said these words: "This is the first stone of the first metropolitan church in New Zealand, with a view to instruct the natives as an example of holiness and piety, which I trust will be such to extend from end to end of these islands the truth and blessings of the gospel." Now we need to bear in mind that was written in 1841, and some perspectives were different to what they are today, but it still underlines this idea of what the hopes and dreams were for St. Paul's for all people, as this pioneer church, that it would pioneer the gospel in this country. Newspapers and magazines throughout the first century, they regularly referred to anything from England as being from home. And often advertisements in the newspapers will really make a big deal of the fact that they have, clothes made from materials from England. Or, Herbert Brothers did this. We use only the finest English glass. Or, carpenters will say we've got English-trained carpenters. There was this sense that what was from England or what was from home was superior to what was made locally. And I think in the same way, Chaucer, as a Christian figurehead for establishing Englishness, is kind of linked again with this sense of this pioneer kind of state. Lastly, the window was dedicated to Canon Nelson, that first vicar that we showed you right at the beginning. I think we're kind of here now. Nelson was educated in Cambridge and Cambridge and London universities. He was our first vicar, as we said, and he was handpicked for St. Paul's by Bishop Selwyn. Like Chaucer, he was an ideal pilgrim in that he worked hard to help society's poor and needy. He was the vice president to Auckland's Benevolent Society, and he was chairman to the Orphan Home Trust Board. As for why it was installed 24 years later, it's not 100% clear. Best guess at the moment is that it was because it was certainly made at the same time as the other windows. It was certainly displayed at the Auckland exhibition. It's probably that funds were just insufficient to pay for the window to then be able to install it. And the interruptions of 2 world wars and a depression and the building of the chancel in stone kind of took priority. And so it doesn't actually get put in our walls until, I think it was 1938. So that's our best guess. So these are actually my favorite windows in this church. I'll be honest. I do love ROs. I think it's fantastic. But I have a soft spot for these 4 because they're so representative of our heritage and our history and our roots and that first church of St. Paul's, of which we have just a few fragments remaining with us today. And I love the fact that it's connected with the carved bosses that we see on the outside and some on the inside too. I just love that kind of link and the interplay between them. And I just want to close with a final thought from Geoffrey Chaucer's window base. Around his shield is wrapped scroll which reads, "If gold rust, then what shall iron do?" It is a quote from the prologue for the parson from Canterbury Tales, and in context it reads this: "And this figure he added eke thereto, that if gold rust, what shall iron do? For if a priest be foul, on whom we trust, no wonder is a lewd man to rust." Chaucer's point is that nobody's perfect. If those like the parson who are upright, respectable, and holy men, gold, can make mistakes, rust, then what more can we expect from common people, iron? I think as we look back over these historical figures of Oswald, Theodore, Theodoric, and Chaucer, and knowing the people and the entities that they each represent and commemorate, it's a comforting reminder that none of us are righteous, no, not one. With humility, we can say that our governors, our bishops, our vicars, our soldiers, and pioneers were not perfect people, and nor are we. But through God's grace, we're able to join him in bringing heaven to earth. God chooses to use imperfect vessels for his great work, and just as he worked through our city's forefathers and church ancestors, imperfect as they were, so too he can and will use us for the glory of his kingdom. Thanks.